I'm really excited we got to speak to Dr. Leah Stokes. Leah is a political scientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she's just become one of the world's leading thinkers about policy change that we need to address climate change.
Well, thanks, Lee, for joining us today. And I just want to get started by asking you about the problem of climate change and why do we have to take it so seriously? And what are you most worried about?
Yeah, well, climate change is a big problem and it's happening now. I think a lot of people, when they think about climate change, assume that it's in the future, that it's going to be for our grandchildren or something like that. But we know that climate change is happening now. And so many of us can see the impacts of the warming that's already happened in our daily lives. So we've already warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius. In certain parts of the country, like where I live in Santa Barbara, we've warmed by 2 degrees Celsius, double the global average. And that leads to things like much worse fire seasons, endless heat waves, so many hurricanes in the Gulf that we run out of letters of the alphabet. So climate change is really happening now, and the longer we delay acting on this problem, really the more it's going to cost to address it.
That's a really important point is the delay, because one of the things that's so kind of infuriating is, what scientists first talked about this, in the 1830s and then the 1850s and in the 1800s. But let's say the more modern era, Jim Hansen and other serious scientists and policy experts were going before Congress, going before federal and international governments, at least in the 1980s, if not earlier than that. So we're talking at least 40 years now of very concerted action. And yet we haven't done enough. We've been sitting in our hands for the most part. And it's cost time and also opportunities. We can't keep the warming below 1 degree. That's already in the bag. Now we're going to scramble to maybe get 1.5 or 2 degrees at best. So time is kind of our enemy here, isn't it? Or maybe our friend if we use it now, but we can't wait any longer, wouldn't you say?
No, we really can't wait any longer. And the fact is that infrastructure, when we make decisions about what kind of energy system we're going to build, those decisions, they get taken maybe in one day or, a few years in the present, but then they last for decades and decades out into the future. We have coal plants right now that are operating that are scheduled to stay open until their 80th birthdays. So the decisions that we make today really have long-term impacts. And if we start to make decisions today that make it cheaper for everybody to make the low carbon choice, the easiest choice and the best choice, then we're going to save money over the course of the transition because we're not going to spend a bunch of money on infrastructure that we then have to retire in a decade or something like that. We're going to invest at the beginning in the right thing, right? A stitch in time saves nine, right? If you do something the right way the first time, it's a lot cheaper than doing the wrong thing and then having to change course later on.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I wonder, this is maybe a little tangent, but it's really an important one, I think, is like some of the things we'll do to address climate change really can happen quickly, like energy efficiency, maybe, stopping deforestation as quickly as possible. These are things where we tap the brakes, we feel it slow down. But other things you point out are kind of deep infrastructure kind of transitions. And we still have power plants that date back to the Roosevelt administration operating in this country right now. Franklin, not Teddy, but still pretty old. And that's going to take a long time, let alone our transportation infrastructure, our agriculture, and every building on Earth is going to have to be remodeled. We're going to have to get rid of all the furnaces and hot water heaters. How do we think about those spans of kind of policy frameworks that some are immediate the wins, maybe we need in the short term, like efficiency, maybe methane, things that buy us a little more breathing room as we do the deeper dive into infrastructure? How do you think about that?
Well, a lot of the times people want to argue that climate change action is so expensive, that climate policy is going to cost money. And it's really just wrong. Not doing anything about climate change costs an enormous amount of money in people's lives, dying in forest fires or in hurricanes or in asthma from fossil fuel combustion in their backyards, particularly Black communities and Hispanic communities and Indigenous communities. The costs of the current system are really, really high. And the cost of not changing course now are also really high because some of the solutions that you talked about, like energy efficiency and even renewables, they save people money. If we retrofit somebody's home and make it more efficient so that they don't have to pay as much for electricity in their monthly bills, that saves people money. If we shut down coal plants that are not economic, meaning that there's no competitive pressure on those coal plants, but they're staying open because it's a monopoly system in places like Southern Company's territory in the Southeast. Those plants getting shut down and replaced by a wind project, energy innovation has shown that that will actually save customers money. And there's a lot of modeling that's suggesting that turning towards clean electricity will save people money on their electricity bills. So climate action can actually save money for everyday people. And then when we think about these longer term investments, like what kind of power plant we're going to build, if we keep building uncontrolled fossil gas plants, meaning natural gas plants that don't control and capture their carbon and put it underground at the same place. If we keep building that stuff, we know we're not going to be able to operate it for very long, because what the research shows is that we cannot build any new fossil fuel infrastructure today and stay within a 1.5 degrees Celsius target. So that means we shouldn't be building any of this new stuff, because we're going to have to mothball it way too early, and it's not going to pay itself back. So really, when we think about the infrastructure changes that we have to make, the first thing to notice is that they're investments, that they're going to pay us back. The second thing to notice is that we want to make smart choices so that we don't have to mothball projects early and pay them off. Right now, when it comes to coal plants, we're facing a huge problem, which is that rather than shutting down coal plants, a lot of utilities decided to retrofit them, and they put an enormous amount of debt, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars into these coal plants to keep them open. So now what we have to do is figure out how can we eliminate that debt and shut down those coal plants, because those bad decisions were made. So making smart climate policy is a cost-saving thing to do, not just in terms of reducing the climate impacts, which are really expensive and growing every year, but also in terms of making sure that our infrastructure investments are for the long term and are growing both clean energy in our country, but also a new industry, a whole energy efficiency industry, home retrofit industry, clean cars, electric vehicles. There's so many things that if we were to start today, we can build on, keep people employed, and have our infrastructure really lock in for the longer term.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on something that's so important for us to all remember. It's like and you're a political scientist, and but I sometimes think like, political science and economics really shouldn't be in separate departments, because they're both kind of myths in a way. There's a political economy, like we have everything mixed together, and they're just different ways of looking at the same system, I guess. And so I wonder about that. Like, sometimes you hear this economic argument, like we can't do this because it's, not economical. I'm like, that's really what you're saying in the subtitles is it's very inconvenient for powerful people right now. So please don't talk about it, And, but I wonder, like, how do we break these logjams? Like, it's often about you've written a lot about like monopolies and about how policy processes kind of get hijacked by special interest and things like this. It's not like a level playing field. We're making logical decisions based on just macroeconomics and thoughtful policy. It's there's no invisible hands. There's hands with their thumb on the scale here, and they're not good hands sometimes. How do we?
No, there sure are. I mean, look at the CARES Act. This was a bill that was supposed to help people stay employed during the pandemic, and it's becoming increasingly clear that an enormous amount of that funding went directly to fossil fuel companies. And this was done both directly through the federal government, like through various agencies, but also through the Federal Reserve. And it seems pretty clear that there was a finger on the scale from the Trump administration, really trying to funnel as much money as possible to an industry that in many ways was in bad financial shape before the crisis hit. For example, fracking companies were going bankrupt before the pandemic hit. And a lot of these companies are not even keeping people employed during the pandemic. So these fossil fuel companies, when they go through bankruptcy, what they'll do is 2 weeks before they declare bankruptcy, they'll give golden parachutes to their own executive, massive agreements, and then lay everybody else off, not worry about the pensions, not worry about the long-term well-being of those employees. And so the CARES Act in many ways was a fossil fuel bailout. And the Trump administration refuses to even tell us the degree to which it was. So our system is not fair. It is for too long been privileging the position of polluting industries. And you can see that so clearly in something like fossil fuel subsidies. We have had fossil fuel subsidies in place for over a century at the federal level, and they are currently at $20 billion a year every single year. And so, that's not fair. That's not an economic system with competition. And the same thing could be said of our electricity system. A lot of our electric utilities are monopolies. They have no competition. If you don't like what your electric provider is doing in terms of burning fossil fuels or running political campaigns to try to stop clean energy, there's nothing you can do about that. You can't choose to buy from another company. And so we really need our governments to be holding these companies accountable and to be saying, hey, you lied about climate change for decades. We don't even know how much money the fossil fuel industry and electric utilities have spent on climate denial, but it is in the billions of dollars. And if you had any public marketing campaign that was in the billions of dollars, it would affect some people's minds and it would delay progress on an issue. So that campaign has been very successful in terms of muddying the waters and slowing down action on climate change. And we need to be holding these companies accountable for the lying and the fraud, really, that they have done for the last several decades. So no, climate change is an area where we have a lot of vested interests in the case of fossil fuel companies and electric utilities, and holding them accountable politically is a really big part of this puzzle.
Well, how do we do that? I mean, you pointed out the Trump administration and previous administrations have had their finger on the scale in favor of special interests. That's always going to be true in political systems, just which flavor of special interests you pick, I guess. But how do we avoid some of that stuff? How do we get more transparency, more fairness into this? Is it a mixture of like from the state and local levels, maybe doing what they can, and the federal? How do activists play a role versus business, for example? Where are the what can we do? We seem to kind of feel like we're powerless here, but we're probably not.
Well, actually, I write about a bunch of that in this book, Over My Shoulder, All We Can Save. I have an essay that's all about what you can do as a person. And what we should be doing as people is more and more pushing out from our smaller lives, not thinking as much about, what am I eating or did I use plastic? Although honestly, I understand why people think about those things because the plastic stuff could drive anybody crazy. It's everywhere. But we need to focus a little bit less on our consumer behaviors and get bigger and more ambitious with the kinds of change that we want to make. And so one of the proposals that I talk about in that essay is working on trying to get fossil fuel money and electric utility money out of our political system. Because there's a bunch of research that I and other political scientists have done, which shows that the more that politicians and staff are taking money from fossil fuel companies, organizations like the American Petroleum Institute, electric utilities, the more they're taking money from those groups, the more they start to listen to those groups, think like those groups, do things that those groups would like them to do. And that might be obvious to people, but we actually show that with scientific evidence. Now, what can we do about that? Well, one thing we can do is run campaigns to say to our politicians, do not take money from utilities. So for example, in Virginia, there was a no Dominion money pledge a couple of years ago where campaigners tried to get it so that politicians running for office did not take money from the electric utility Dominion. And after that campaign and a bunch of Democrats got into office and were not beholden to that utility anymore, they actually passed a clean electricity standard in that state. We can see the sad version of that story by looking at Ohio, where both Republicans and Democrats have taken so much money from electric utilities like First Energy and AEP and coal companies like Murray Energy. They've taken so much money from these companies, and we've seen, because the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Ohio, Larry Householder, was arrested by the FBI, that they dramatically influenced the policy in that state. In that case, passing a coal bailout that was billions of dollars, rolling back the clean energy policies in that state. And the sad thing there is that were Democrats not also in the pocket of those utilities, that coal bailout bill would not have passed because it actually required Democratic votes in order to pass. And so you might say, oh, it's going to be hard to get Republicans to stop taking money from the fossil fuel industry, but we also need Democrats to stop taking money from the fossil fuel industry. And so I would encourage people to think about, is there a campaign that I can run in my state or my local area to get this utility and fossil fuel money out of politics? That's one thing I recommend. And then there's a bunch of other ideas in that essay if people are interested in checking it out.
Well, I'd highly recommend that book for anybody watching this too. This is those two books, by the way, in your bookcase are ones that are in my bookcase as well. But you wrote those, I didn't. So they're both wonderful, wonderful resources. So go out and get those. Well, we've talked a lot about policy, changes, which you're just an incredible expert in and have shared so much with the country on these things lately. But I'm also interested in policies that can be kind of incentives, your colleague Greg Nemeth, for example, at Wisconsin, wrote a book about why solar energy got really cheap, and was arguing, federal money and R&D helps at the beginning, and then incentives like in Germany to kind of push the market along to say, hey, we're going to give this one an extra nudge, and then market forces can take over and snowball, as Chinese manufacturing makes things cheaper and more ubiquitous. What can we do there too? Can we not only, push against the bad stuff, can we help incentivize some of the good stuff? We need the push and the pull, don't we?
Absolutely. We're going to have hopefully a big opportunity in 2021 for climate action at the federal level in the United States. And we need to take the kinds of approach that Greg Nemeth, for example, shows in his research, which is excellent. We need to be thinking about setting standards, saying, here's where we're going by this deadline. Clean cars need to be done by you only have 100% clean cars that are being sold by the year 2030 or 2035. You have 100% clean electricity by the year 2035. We're setting the framework for where the entire market is going. And that sends very powerful signals across the economy that you need to stop investing in combustion engine cars and gas-fired power plants that have no control technology on them for carbon dioxide, that you need to start investing in clean energy and clean cars. So that is the kind of approach, and much like Greg Nemeth shows, worked in practice in places like Germany, also in Canada, and even in the United States, is investments. We need the federal government to be investing in this clean energy transition. We can't assume that we can push the costs of the transition onto everyday Americans, particularly not when we have such rampant income inequality in this country, particularly on racial lines. And when we think about the fact that so many people right now during this pandemic are struggling to pay their energy bills as it is. And so if we're saying, okay, we're not going to push the cost of the transition onto everyday people, we have to think about where that costs are going to go. And my suggestion is that they should go into government investments, because those investments will really pay themselves off in the long term. Because as people like Greg Nemeth have shown in their work, you invest some money at time one, then the costs of the technology fall, it becomes so much cheaper, and you can expand the deployment from there on out. And when we think about this standards and investment approach, we also have to center justice. We have to make sure that when we're putting investments into communities, whether that's, a credit or a grant for somebody to help them buy an electric vehicle, to make an electric vehicle the same price as a combustion engine car. We have to make sure that everybody can access those policies, because those policies that we've had on the books to date have really been more accessible to wealthier and whiter Americans. That's what the research shows on things like solar adoption and EV adoption. And we need to make sure that everybody across this country, including in, for example, fossil fuel communities historically, we need to make sure that they can afford the transition. We need to make sure that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities that have been the sites of fossil fuel combustion and a lot of the toxic effects of our fossil fuel system, we need to make sure that they can benefit from this transition. And so that standards, investment, and justice approach, I think, is a very powerful way that we can drive progress at the pace that's necessary with government policy, and making sure that we're not leaving any communities behind, whether that's a coal community or a Black community or an Indigenous community. We need all the parts of this country to be on board with this transition, because the reality is it's going to take quite a while to clean up carbon pollution from across all of the sectors in our economy.
I've personally been frustrated, I think you have too, and probably a lot of folks, at the lack of action at the federal level, but that's not the only place policy matters. A lot of the things that matter happen at a state level. You live in California, which is often leading the nation in this. I'm in Minnesota, which has sometimes been a great climate leader as well, and Texas, ironically, and wind power, things like this can stand up and change the nation as well. But a lot of governing is kind of local too, like things like building codes and zoning. It's not as sexy, but we need those to work too. Like, we need people to know that heat pumps are actually a good idea. And, the building code should incentivize more walking and more mass transit than just more sprawl, things like this. So, what do you think about that too? Like, can we how do we make sure we don't get stuck on just one level of agency, if you will, and that we really are thinking, like, I loved your starting with yourself and pushing outward, but we need to start at the top and push, towards us too. There's a whole continuum of action possibilities from all of us, don't you think?
Absolutely. I wrote a whole book, this other book about state policies. And so I do think that the state leadership has been so critical. Right now, we have 25% of the states in this country targeting 100% clean electricity. And that really sets the agenda for the federal government to act, right? Because it says, look, a quarter of this country is already on that pathway. What about the rest of you? How are we going to back that up with federal investments? And so what states and local governments do can really spill up into the federal government and can provide inspiration and policy ideas for federal leadership. We're focused so much on the federal government right now because we have been taking this subnational state and local and corporate action approach for more than a decade now in the absence of federal leadership. And it's just not going to add up to enough. It's not going to be fast enough, and it's not going to have enough resources behind it. Because the fact is the federal government is still our most well-resourced government, has the most ability to raise funds, the most ability to spend funds. And especially during the pandemic, it's going to be hard for states to keep leading this. So we do need the federal government. But it certainly doesn't end there. And it's not even just, cities with building codes and things like that. I have this dream that somebody like Chip and Joanna Gaines is the one I always say, but it could be anybody, who has a TV show and a very big platform and who reaches millions of people across this country, will start to retrofit homes or start to talk about things like induction stoves and heat pumps and really make them understandable to a lot more people, and talk about how much healthier and safer it is to not be burning gas that maybe leaks a little bit of methane in your home for your cooking and your heating, and start to talk about how much better it is to use an induction stove, for example. Most chefs prefer an induction stove to gas. And so there's also this cultural element in terms of marketing these technologies to the masses, things like electric vehicles. During the CNN Climate Town Hall a year ago, Andrew Yang was asked about why would people want to drive EVs? And Andrew Yang said, EVs are cooler and they're better. And why wouldn't you want to? And as an EV driver myself, I will say EVs are better. It's actually a better technology. And so there's also a role for corporate leadership here and for cultural leaders, celebrities, people like that, to be talking about the kinds of changes that they're making to adopt technology. Not so much changes like, I'm not using a plastic straw, but things like I put solar on my roof, or now I have a heat pump, and here's an induction stove, or here's an electric vehicle. And to get that adoption of these technologies ramped up. So it's not just the federal government, although that's going to be critical to make sure that the investments can go all across the economy. There's a lot of other actors who can step up. And I'll say one other thing about corporate leadership. The company Google has made a really exciting pledge in the last month, which is that it will have 100% renewable energy, that it will have 100% clean energy at all its facilities in real time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by the year 2030. That is an extremely bold target. And it's since Google is one of the largest energy consumers in our country, it's saying, hey, we're going to ramp up this clean electricity thing a lot faster than you think. And what's so cool is that if we can clean up our electricity system by 2030, 2035, we can use that clean electricity to power our building sector, our transportation sector, about half of our heavy industry. And that adds up to something like 70 to 80% of our carbon emissions. And so this pathway is not just sort of a small slice of the problem. By creating a clean electricity system, we have a vector, a tool that we can use to decarbonize huge parts of our economy. It may not get us to 100%, but it reduces the climate problem down so much into really electrifying as much as we can and powering it with clean power. So these kinds of corporate actions that are meaningful and that, are ambitious timelines and that are backed with real investments, Those I really believe in. There are lots of other corporate targets, largely by electric utilities and fossil fuel companies, which I do not believe in whatsoever, because they're not on timelines that are realistic. They're not backed by anything in terms of investments or plans or laws. But we are beginning to see a few corporate leaders, and I'm hopeful that we might start to see a coalition forming to really ramp up climate action.
Yeah, one of the things we actually work on a little bit at Project Drawdown, and I should disclose Google is one of our partners in this.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
No, but we want to be transparent. Is that, corporate leaders were saying like, hey, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050 or something, and like in our own little operational footprint. I'm like, you're kidding, right? Like a company, I won't name this, but a company that's changed the shopping of the planet is committing to something like this. I'm like, that's all you can do? I mean, really? Because you've changed the nature of everybody's lives around the world. Couldn't you do more than outside your operational footprint? Like, how about using all of your resources to make the world around you better? And so we worked with Intuit, who makes like tax software and bookkeeping. They committed to going 50 times beyond carbon neutral by 2030. Now, they're a lot smaller than a Google, but that's starting to be real leadership. That's like when they say, hey, wait a minute, we shouldn't just be like walking down the beach and only picking up the trash that happens to be orange. Like, no, pick up all the trash, get it all, get everything you can, because you have the ability to do something. Google and other companies do too. And that's what's pretty inspiring, is when there's corporate, not just compliance, but corporate kind of leadership. It's not going to be perfect. Nobody ever is. But that's kind of exciting. And if we can kind of both hold the feet to the fire for somebody's not being very, genuine, but also really kind of, celebrate like, hey, that's actually pretty helpful. This alongside good policy and culture change, we kind of need it all, don't we?
We do. And I think the thing about these more meaningful corporate pledges, which mostly I don't think they're meaningful, but there are a few that we can get excited about. What I really want those companies to do, like Google or maybe Intuit or others, is to show up when we have a big federal fight over climate policy and lobby for action. Because too often, these companies who are leaders kind of in their own operations or maybe even outside their own operations, they're not leaders politically. And that means that we have very strong opponents from the fossil fuel industry, from electric utilities, et cetera, who show up and say, don't ever do any climate policy. And we don't have a coalition of action. And it drives me particularly crazy to see that, because so many of these companies are headquartered in Silicon Valley, in California, where I live, and they are seeing the exact same climate impacts that I am seeing in my life. They are seeing these wildfires year after year, these horrible smoke from the wildfires literally turning the sky orange. They're seeing sea level rise. If they look at maps of their own corporate headquarters, they should recognize that if we don't change course, they're not going to be able to have a campus in Silicon Valley anymore. And so I don't understand why there's such a disconnect between, their own physical assets and their lobbying on climate action. But I'm hopeful that maybe 2020 is a year where we have more of these companies wake up. I don't know how you can live through this summer and this record wildfire season for the West Coast, where an area the size of New Jersey has burned, where people have been living under so much smoke that they couldn't go outside for days and the skies have turned orange. If you are an executive in Silicon Valley and you've lived through that, I feel like maybe that might wake you up and might cause you to think, you know what, 2021, maybe we should lobby for climate policy this time.
Yeah, and that one specifically is kind of amazing, considering the mass exodus of people out of Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And I think the tipping point for a lot of people wasn't the housing cost alone, wasn't COVID alone, wasn't the homelessness alone. It was then the fires year after year. Like, geez, I can't even go to Yosemite. I can't go to Big Sur. I can't go outside. That was the one saving grace of living there for a long time. And that's taken away from people in the last 4 or 5 years for like a month out of the year, if not longer. At least a lot of my friends are like, okay, that's it. I'm out of here. I was one of them. And
I mean, the forests have all been closed. The national forests in many parts of California are not open. You can't go to them. And I've been wanting to go backpacking myself as a sanity thing. And you can't go. They're literally closed. And when they're open, as for example, Los Padres in my backyard reopened, we had a heat wave again for like another 3 weeks. It is finally broken, but it was like 100 degrees all the time. And the concept that you're going to go like hike in a very dry, hot area during the fire season, it doesn't feel very safe. And so No, I mean, the reality is that climate change is happening now. And I think a lot of people have this theory in their head that, like, maybe if they're wealthy enough that they can avoid it. But no, you can't. You don't live on a parallel planet. David Wallace Wells, who wrote An Uninhabitable Earth, tells the story of when he gives these talks. Sometimes these wealthy guys will come up to him afterwards and be like, yeah, well, I'm not that worried about it because I'm going to be okay. And it's like, no, look what's happening in California in very wealthy neighborhoods. Places like Malibu, for example, burning down, right? Like, this is not an issue that you can insulate yourself from, no matter how wealthy you are. You know, maybe you have some dreams that we're all living on Mars, but that doesn't seem very realistic. And so no matter how much money you have, you still live on the planet Earth. And what happens here, we're all interconnected, and it's going to affect you too. So I'm hopeful that some of these wealthy people will start to realize that they don't live in some magical bubble, and that climate change is happening now, and it's coming for them too.
There's a scary story, which you just told beautifully, but what about the other story? I mean, like, there's threat multipliers and the bad stuff's going to make bad things worse. We already see that, unfortunately. But I don't know. I'm a hopeless optimist in some ways. That I think there might be kind of solution multipliers too. If we solve part of the climate crisis in a smart way, and the center justice and equity and just smart thinking and good policy and good economics and forward thinking, we can actually help along a lot of our other social ills, can't we?
Absolutely. This idea that, like, we have so many problems and how are we going to deal with them all? Well, we can start to see the connections between those problems, and we can take them on at the same time. And there are going to be these positive spirals. So for example, if we start to clean up our economy and we employ people in every state, city, county across this country to retrofit homes, to make them more energy efficient, to make them more safe in terms of like mold, indoor air pollution, and of course to remove fossil gas. Those jobs, they can't be taken overseas, and they have to happen in every single corner of this country because we have fossil gas in homes pretty much everywhere. So that means that there are going to be new people employed in that sector, and they're going to see the benefits of having these jobs, and they're going to start to say, hey, I like this policy, let's expand it, or let's not roll it back. And so that will be something that will help us lock in those policy gains while employing people and potentially redistributing wealth across our society. And you could say the same thing with electricity. When we clean up our electricity system, we will have a clean source of power that will allow us to unlock emissions reductions in transportation, in buildings, in heavy industry. And so it's not just cleaning up one sector of the economy. That's going to have huge spillovers for other sectors too. So I think that as we go along with this transition, if we could just get started, we will find that there's so much work to be done. There's so much good paying jobs that we can create, and that this can be an engine of economic growth and opportunity and job creation that we really haven't seen in like 100 years, right? When you get overwhelmed about climate change and you think, wow, there's so much to do and so little time to do it, you can turn that on its head and you can say, wow, there's so much to do and there's so little time to do it. Therefore, we got to employ a lot of people. There's a lot of work to be done. And so the urgency and the scale of the crisis is also a massive opportunity. And it's an opportunity to get people to work and to employ them at a fair wage and in meaningful jobs.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great way to end. Well, thank you so much, Leah. It's really, really great to have you here.